If you spend 38 years designing and constructing bridges throughout the Pacific Northwest, structures that had to hold up under pressure against the elements against time. When you design bridges, you learn to read stress patterns. You learn where a structure is weakest before it ever fails. You learn to calculate loads and tensions. My name is Jocelyn Ardmore. I'm 67 years old. And what I never calculated was the mathematics of a son who would arrive at my door with a $167,000 invoice wrapped in corporate language and deliver it like an inheritance I hadn't earned. The envelope showed up on a Tuesday, cream-colored, expensive. The kind of paper that costs more than the coffee I drank at 5 o'clock in the morning. Inside, an itemized breakdown of a wedding for my son Calvin, or Calvin J as we've called him since childhood. Line item after line item. Venue in the Belltown district of Seattle. Catering at $125 per head. Floral arrangements imported from somewhere I'd never heard of. Photography, videography. A luxury retreat in the San Juan Islands instead of a honeymoon. At the bottom, in the handwriting of his fiancée Sheldon, a note. Jocelyn, we wanted to make sure you felt included in the way that truly matters. Your contribution means everything to us. I read it twice. Then I poured myself another coffee and stepped out onto my back porch. My husband Norbert's garden was still producing even though he'd been gone 4 years. The tomato plants were heavy with late summer fruit. Norbert used to say that plants were honest in ways people rarely were. They showed you what they needed. No pretense. No performance. Before I continue, I need to ask where you're watching from right now. Drop your city and state in the comments. And if you've ever had to face a moment where someone you love tried to reduce your value to a transaction, please like and subscribe. This one matters. Norbert died of a sudden aneurysm. One moment he was making dinner, the next everything changed. 4 years ago, but some things don't get easier with time. They just become parts of your daily geography. Calvin J and I grew close after he died. We talked every Sunday. He'd come over for dinners I'd cook poorly. We'd sit in Norbert's garden and he'd tell me about his life. His work in tech, a developer for one of the big companies over in Redmond. For about 8 months, we were as connected as we'd been since childhood. Then he met Sheldon Price. Sheldon came from old Seattle money, the kind that traces back to railroad families and early tech investments. His father ran a venture capital firm. His mother sat on museum boards and orchestral committees. Sheldon himself worked in wealth advisory, which I understood to mean he helped rich people figure out how to stay rich while making it sound like financial expertise rather than inheritance management. He was polished, intelligent, composed in a way that suggested he'd been trained in composure the way other people were trained in their professions. The 2 times Calvin J brought him to my house in those first 6 months I watched. Not unkindly, but I watched. I noticed the way his eyes moved across my workshop, the tools I'd collected over 40 years, the blueprints on the walls, the models of bridges I'd built. I saw him adjust his expression like someone touring a museum of obsolete things. When he mentioned Norbert's garden, he called it charmingly modest with character, which is what people say when they mean something is below their expectations, but they're too polished to say so directly. The first real fracture appeared at Norbert's memorial garden dedication. The city had installed a small bench in his honor at the elementary school where he'd volunteered. 30 people, simple ceremony, lemonade afterward in the school library. Sheldon attended, but spent most of his time on his phone. When I gave a short speech about Norbert's belief that education was the only investment that compounded like interest over a lifetime, I saw Sheldon lean toward Calvin J and say something that made him smile and look at his shoes. I filed that away like an engineer marks a weak point on a blueprint worth monitoring. 6 months ago, Calvin J called on a Wednesday evening, not a Sunday. That was unusual. His voice had the cadence of something rehearsed, something he'd practiced with someone else in the room before dialing. Mom, Sheldon and I are engaged. We wanted you to know. We'd love to take you to dinner to celebrate. I told him I was happy for him. I asked when they were free. We're pretty swamped with planning right now. We'll figure something out, he said. We never figured something out. What I received instead over the next 3 months was a series of carefully orchestrated withdrawals. A dinner scheduled, then rescheduled twice, then quietly cancelled. A Thanksgiving invitation that vanished because Sheldon's family had a property on San Juan Island, and the entire Price clan was summering there. A Christmas call that lasted 12 minutes, interrupted by Sheldon asking Calvin J questions I could hear but couldn't quite make out. I am not a woman who demands attention. Norbert raised us both better than that, but I am a woman who reads patterns. The pattern I was reading said that someone had decided I didn't fit the picture being assembled. The invoice confirmed it. I sat at my kitchen table for 45 minutes after reading those words, 45 minutes before I made the first call, not to Calvin J., not to my sister Shalette, who would have told me to burn something down. I called my financial advisor first, a woman named Carol Watkins, who'd managed my retirement accounts for a dozen years. Carol, I said, I need to structure something specific. Money goes in, but nothing comes out without my written authorization on each transaction. For what? She asked. My son's wedding. Specifically, to ensure I control what gets paid and what doesn't. How much are we talking about? $167,000. And Carol, I'm not invited to this wedding. She was quiet for a long moment. Jocelyn, do you want to attend this wedding? It was the first time anyone had asked me that question directly. Not whether I should pay, not whether I wanted to support my son, whether I wanted to attend. What I want is my son, I said. The wedding is secondary. Those two things might require the same action, Carol said. Let me get the structure in place by end of business. That evening I called Darlette. Darlette had been my college roommate at UW decades ago, and she'd stayed in Seattle. She'd become a contractor who knew everyone in the construction world for a 100-mile radius. She'd been at my wedding. She'd sat beside me at Norbert's funeral. She was the kind of friend who showed up at the significant moments without being asked. Darlette, I said, I need your eyes and ears on something. What? My son's wedding. Something about this isn't adding up. I can't see the whole structure from where I'm standing. Darlette was quiet. The venue is the Belltown loft space, right? I know someone in the event planning world. Give me a few days. 2 days later, Darlette called back. Her voice had the tone of someone delivering information she didn't enjoy delivering. Jocelyn, this wedding isn't just big. It's being positioned. Sheldon hired something called a social strategist. That's an actual paid position for making sure the right photographs get to the right people in the Seattle Society pages. His father's firm also moved capital recently. There are rumors about some investments underperforming. And here's the thing, the guest list isn't just Seattle's financial sector. It's a who's who. Partners from tech firms, venture capitalists, someone whose family owns a chain of hospitals. There's a whole table marked Legacy Network in the seating chart. And Jocelyn, your name is on that table with a question mark next to it. Question mark. After 37 years of being a mother, I'd been reduced to a question mark in my own son's seating chart. Darlette, I said, keep watching. The next morning my phone rang. The venue coordinator at Belltown Lofts. She was calling to confirm my authorization for a $42,000 wire transfer for the venue deposit. The transfer was needed within 72 hours. I haven't authorized any deposit, I said. If you're expecting payment from me, you'll need my written authorization first. In writing. In my hand. Confusion. Apologies. She'd been told I was the primary financial contact. You were told incorrectly, I said. Don't process anything in my name without my signature. When I hung up, I felt something settle in my chest. The satisfaction of an engineer who'd identified where the weight was being distributed incorrectly and had begun the redistribution. Calvin J. called within 2 hours. Mom, why are you telling the venue coordinator not to process anything? Because I didn't authorize it. You're listed as the financial contact on the account. I didn't agree to that. I didn't authorize any of this. Mom, we're trying to plan a wedding. We don't need you making this complicated. There was a sound in the background. Door closing. Sheldon entering or leaving the room. Calvin J., I said carefully. You sent me an invoice for $167,000 for a wedding I'm not invited to attend. I'm not making this complicated. This is the level of complication that already exists. I'm just the first person saying it out loud. Silence. Then Sheldon's voice, clear enough for me to hear. She's never supported our relationship. Sheldon, I said, you've given me very little opportunity to support anything. I've been rescheduled, redirected, and now uninvited. What exactly are you looking for from me that doesn't involve a wire transfer? He hung up. I went out to Norbert's garden and spent 3 hours working, pruning dead growth, turning soil, the kind of work that clears a woman's mind when thinking gets too loud. That evening, Sheldon appeared at my front door. He was wearing something expensive and carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my first car payment. I did not invite him in. We stood on the porch in the October light. Jocelyn, he said, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. We've gotten off on several wrong feet over 2 years, I said. Which one concerns you today? He opened the portfolio and showed me photographs. Belltown lofts in full splendor, marble chandeliers, a space that looked like it cost money just to stand in. This wedding represents everything Calvin J has worked toward, he said. The connections in that room will define his professional network for the next decade. We're not just celebrating a marriage. We're announcing who we are, who we're becoming. And who are you becoming? Yes. He seemed momentarily disconcerted by the question. We're people with real ambitions, he said, and the relationships to match those ambitions. What about where he comes from? Yes. What about his father? What about the people who built the foundation you're standing on? Calvin J's past is something we honor privately, he said. This event is about his future. His future is built on his past, I said. His past includes his father and his mother. If honoring us is something that only happens in private, you're asking him to be ashamed of the people who loved him before you knew his name. His composure shifted just slightly. The kind of micro-fracture that engineers and careful observers learn to recognize. I came here to extend an olive branch, Jocelyn, he said. No, I said, you came here to secure funding. The olive branch is decorative. His expression hardened into something cold and precise. The coldness of someone unaccustomed to being read accurately. My family is prepared to cover the remaining balance if you choose not to participate, he said. But Calvin J will know it was because you refused to contribute. Then Calvin J will know that I chose not to fund an event I'm not permitted to attend, I said. That seems like accurate information for him to have. He left. His footsteps on my porch stairs sounded like small deliberate strikes, one after another descending. Darlot called the next morning with information I hadn't anticipated. Jocelyn, I looked into the Price family finances. Public records, some conversations with people who know people. That venture capital firm Sheldon's father runs. It's been underperforming for 3 years. There are rumors about a restructuring. The money they present to the world is not the money they actually have. How does that connect to the wedding? Yes. A wedding like this costs as much as a down payment on a small commercial building, Darlot said. If they were actually liquid, they wouldn't be asking you. The fact that they need your $167,000 tells you something about where they really stand. They need to project stability they don't actually have. They need you to fund the projection. That afternoon I called Carol back and added another layer to the account structure. I drafted a legal statement reviewed by my attorney, a sharp woman named Beverly Marsh, who'd handled my affairs since Norbert's estate, stating that my name on any vendor contract did not constitute financial guarantee without my explicit written consent to each transaction. Beverly strengthened the language and had it notarized by Thursday afternoon. Jocelyn, before we finish, Beverly said, I need to ask you something. Do you actually want to attend this wedding? I want my son back, I said. The wedding is secondary. Those two things may require the same action, Beverly said. I was hearing that from everyone and I was starting to believe it was true. Calvin J called Friday evening. His voice was different this time. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was left sounded younger, less certain. I recognized it as the voice he'd used at 16 when he'd broken the windshield of my car and spent 2 days working up the courage to tell me, Mom, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Go ahead. Do you think Sheldon is wrong for me? I was quiet for a long moment. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer required more care than most answers do. I think Sheldon wants a version of you that requires you to be ashamed of where you came from, I said. Whether that makes him wrong for you depends on whether you can live as that version of yourself indefinitely. Whether you can spend the rest of your life hiding the people who built you. A long silence. Then, he's not ashamed of me. But it sounded like a question pretending to be a statement. He's ashamed of me, I said. And I'm the bridge between who you are and who you were. If he can't tolerate that bridge, he's asking you to sever the connection on your end. To disconnect from me to connect with his version of success. He didn't hang up. We stayed on the line in silence for nearly a minute. A long time when no one is speaking. I love him, Mom. I know you do, I said. That's not what I'm questioning. Then what are you questioning? Whether he loves you or whether he loves the life he can build using you as a foundation. Another silence. Then quietly, I need to think. Good, I said. Thinking is what engineers do before they commit weight to a structure. The following week, Darlot called with information that reoriented everything. Sheldon had been meeting with a luxury real estate developer. He'd toured 3 high-end condominiums in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, properties priced between $850,000 and $1.3 million. He'd done this 3 times over 6 weeks, each time with a different financial advisor. A colleague of Darlot's at one of the buildings mentioned with the careful indiscretion of someone who found the situation interesting that Sheldon had discussed financing scenarios that assumed a household income significantly higher than Calvin J's current salary. And a co-signer with substantial assets. The picture assembled itself with the grim clarity of a load analysis that reveals a structure was never meant to hold what's been placed on it. Sheldon wasn't planning a wedding. He was planning an acquisition. I called Beverly immediately. Beverly, I need you to check something for me. Can you research whether Sheldon Price has any LLCs or business entities registered in Washington state? Beverly called back the next morning. Jocelyn, there's an LLC. Price Design Consulting. Filed 8 months ago. Sheldon is the sole proprietor. Registered address is a mail service in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. No public-facing business website, but the account has been active. And Jocelyn, the transaction patterns are unusual. Money coming in from multiple sources, more going out. The pattern is consistent with money moving through a vehicle rather than operating as a legitimate business. I drove to Calvin J's apartment that evening unannounced. Something I'd never done in the 4 years he'd lived there. He opened the door in a t-shirt and looked startled. Then something softer crossed his face. Mom, hey, can I come in? Yeah, of course. Sheldon wasn't there. He had a charity gala, Calvin J said with the tone of someone who'd learned not to ask follow-up questions about charity galas. I sat at his kitchen table, the same table we'd bought together from a craftsman in Pike Place Market, and I showed him what Beverly had found. The LLC, the condo tours, the income assumptions that far exceeded his salary. The pattern that suggested financial engineering disguised as relationship building. Calvin J read each page carefully. He'd always been methodical. Norbert used to say that most people answered questions before they'd finished reading them. Not Calvin J. He finished reading. When he looked up, his eyes held the particular pain of someone whose understanding of something fundamental had just shifted underneath them, like unstable ground. He said the condo shopping was just research, he said. Market research for a lifestyle we'd build together someday. Market research that assumes you'd have resources you don't currently have, I said. And co-signers with substantial assets. His mother's assets, Calvin J. He's not planning a lifestyle with you. He's planning an acquisition using you as the acquisition vehicle. He stared at the table for a long time. Mom, what if I'm wrong about him? Then he'll prove me wrong by standing beside you when the money is off the table, I said. That's the only proof that matters. The engagement party was supposed to be held at the Price family's country club the following Saturday. I wasn't invited. What I did receive was an invitation to lunch with Calvin J., which I suspected was either a gesture of reconciliation or a test of some kind. We met at a diner near his office, where the coffee was strong and nobody cared what you wore or who your family's money was. Calvin J. arrived looking like a man carrying weather inside him. Sheldon and I talked last night, he said, about everything. The money, your concerns, all of it. How did he respond? Asked. He said you'd been gathering evidence against him. He said you were trying to sabotage our relationship because you couldn't accept that I'd built a life bigger than the one you'd planned for me. He said my past was something to move past, not something to build on. Poured more coffee. What did you say? Asked. Calvin J. wrapped both hands around his coffee cup the way he used to hold a hot chocolate on cold mornings when he was 9 years old. I said that my mother doesn't gather evidence. She reads structures. She observes patterns. And that if there were things in his business accounts that looked like evidence, it was because they were there to be seen. I told him that you weren't trying to sabotage our relationship. You were trying to show me that the foundation was unstable before he asked me to build a house on it. I looked at my son and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. And then, asked. And then he said if I was going to take your side over his, then maybe I didn't understand what he needed in a partner. He said he needed someone who would choose the future over the past. Someone who wouldn't let his mother dictate his ambitions. What did you say to that? Asked. I said I was starting to think I didn't know what he needed in a partner either. And that maybe that was important information. The engagement party proceeded without incident. Darlett reported that Sheldon attended with his family and said nothing publicly about the state of things. The performance continued for exactly 11 more days. On a Wednesday evening, my doorbell rang. Calvin J. stood on my porch holding a cardboard box. He looked like a man who'd made a difficult decision and was only now feeling the full weight of it. He ended it, he said, when I told him the wedding needed to be scaled back. That we couldn't take on debt we couldn't service. That I wasn't going to ask you to fund something you weren't welcomed at. He said that told him everything he needed to know about my priorities. He said I'd chosen my past over my future. I stepped back and let him in. He set the box on the coffee table where Norbert's photograph sat in a silver frame, and he sat on the couch like gravity was working harder on him than usual. In the box were things from Sheldon's apartment, a jacket, some books, a framed photograph of him and Norbert from 3 years ago that Sheldon had apparently kept in the guest room rather than anywhere visible. The room where you put things you don't want to see every day. Calvin J. picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long time. Dad would have seen this coming, he said quietly. Your father saw most things coming, I said. He just waited until you were ready to see them too. The structure teaches you, not me telling you about the structure. A conclusion your mother drags you to isn't really your conclusion. It's just a direction you're being pointed. Calvin J. set the photograph down between us. Mom, I owe you something bigger than an apology. I let someone make you a question mark in your own son's life. You should have been the first call, not the last problem I got around to solving. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through Norbert's tomato vines. I thought about those plants, how they were honest in ways people rarely were, how they showed you what they needed. The thing about bridges, I said finally, is that the cables that hold the most weight are the ones you don't notice until they're gone. Then the whole structure tells you what it needed. You noticed, Calvin J. That's what matters. And now I want to pause here because I think if you're watching this right now, you might be feeling what Calvin J. was feeling in this moment. That confusion, that vertigo of realizing someone you loved had been using you as infrastructure for their own ambitions. If you've ever experienced that sickening moment when someone's true motivation becomes visible, I want you to know something. It's not your fault that you didn't see it sooner. People who are good at this kind of thing are very, very good at it. They practice. They have models. They understand human psychology the way an engineer understands materials. And sometimes it takes an outside observer, someone who loves you and isn't invested in the lie, to help you see the pattern. Calvin J. stayed for dinner. We made pasta the way Norbert used to make it with way too much garlic and zero apologies for the garlic. And we talked for 3 hours about nothing consequential. His job, my garden, a book we'd both read years ago and remembered in completely different ways. The kind of conversation that doesn't require resolution. Its only purpose is presence. The financial cleanup happened methodically over the following weeks. The Belltown Lofts deposit had been held in my escrow account and was released back to my restricted funds without ever transferring to the venue. Thanks to Beverly's letter and Carol's structure, Darlett's contacts confirmed that the Price family was quietly absorbing the vendor cancellation fees, approximately $28,000, with a tight-lipped efficiency of people who'd managed embarrassing financial situations before and knew how to do it without publicity. A man identifying himself as the wedding coordinator called me once. His name was Preston Vale. His voice had the diminished confidence of a man whose leverage had evaporated. "Ms. Ardmore, there are outstanding commitments that may require resolution." "Mr. Vale," I said, "the commitments you're referring to were made without my authorization. My attorney has documented that clearly. I'd suggest you direct your concerns to Mr. Price." He didn't call again. Beverly confirmed shortly after that no legal action was coming my way. The vendor contracts, closely examined, bore Sheldon's signature as the primary client. My name appeared as a courtesy contact. The kind of deliberate ambiguity that Preston Vale had probably used before to pressure reluctant family members. It didn't hold up. And here's what I want to say about this moment. 'Cause I think it matters. This is where Jocelyn Ardmore could have felt vindicated. This is where she could have felt she'd won something. But that's not what she felt. She felt tired. She felt the particular exhaustion that comes from being right about something you really wished you were wrong about. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're gathering evidence against someone you love, financial evidence, emotional evidence, behavioral evidence, please know that proving you're right isn't the same as winning. What you're actually doing is documenting a loss. 3 months after the cancelled engagement, Calvin J. and I established a new rhythm. Wednesday dinners, alternating locations. Sometimes my house, sometimes a restaurant, sometimes just 2 chairs in Norbert's garden when the weather permitted. We talked about Norbert more than we had since he died. And I think he would have approved of that. Grief has a way of becoming present again when you stop being afraid of it. One Wednesday in January, Calvin J. arrived with a question I hadn't expected. "Mom, can I bring someone to dinner next week? Just casual. Just someone I'd like you to meet." I told him, of course. Her name was Sophie. She was a pediatric nurse who'd grown up in Tacoma, drove a Honda that was 10 years old with 140,000 miles on it, and brought a pie she'd made herself because she'd asked Calvin J. what his mother liked, and he'd said his father's apple pie. So she'd made her own version because she'd figured that was enough information to work with. She was warm without performing warmth. She asked about my bridge designs with the specific curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand. She looked at Norbert's photograph on the mantel and said without prompting, "Calvin talks about him all the time. He sounds like someone I would have really liked." After dinner, after Sophie had gone home and Calvin J. was helping me with dishes, he said, "Well, she brought pie." I said, "Is that a verdict?" "It's a very good start," he said. He laughed, the laugh I remembered from before, unguarded, a little too loud, the one Norbert used to say could wake up a room that didn't know it was sleeping. That evening, after Calvin J. left, I sat in Norbert's garden in the cold January air longer than was probably sensible for a 67-year-old woman with a brace on my knee. The tomato plants were dormant now, cut back to their winter stubs, looking like they had no intention of returning, but they always did. Stubborn, contrary, perennial. I thought about the invoice that had started all of it. $167,000 for a performance I wasn't invited to watch. At the time, it felt like the worst thing that had arrived in my mailbox since the hospital bills after Norbert's stroke. What it actually was, I understood now, was a load test, the kind engineers run on structures to find out what they're genuinely made of. You apply pressure at the critical points, and you watch to see what holds and what gives way. The things that gave way needed to. The things that held, those were what mattered. And I want to speak directly to anyone watching this who is in a similar situation right now. Maybe you're a parent being asked to fund something you're not welcomed at. Maybe you're watching someone you love be used as infrastructure for someone else's ambitions. Maybe you're the person in the middle, being pulled between your past and your future, and you don't know how to honor both. Here's what I've learned. Real love doesn't ask you to amputate your past. Real love asks you to bring your whole self, your history, your people, your foundation to the table. If someone is asking you to be ashamed of the people who built you, they're not asking for love. They're asking for raw material, and you deserve better than that. I went inside and made tea and called my sister Charlotte to tell her how things had turned out. She said she was glad I hadn't burned anything down. I told her I'd thought about it. She said that was probably enough. I looked at Norbert's photograph before I turned off the kitchen light. Him smiling that particular smile, like he knew something worth knowing and wasn't in any hurry to tell you. I thought he might have been a little proud. Not of the outcome exactly. Of the method. Of the patience that allowed the truth to assemble itself rather than forcing it before it was ready. Real love, he used to say, doesn't require an audience. Just requires showing up. Now, I want to ask you directly, what would you have done in Jocelyn Ardmore's position? Comment 1 if you think she made the right call and would have done the same thing. Comment 2 if you think the Price family deserved a second chance and should have been given more time to prove themselves. Comment 3 if you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between funding someone's ambitions or protecting your relationship with them. And please comment below with your location and what time of day it is where you are right now. I genuinely love reading comments from all over the world, and I want to hear your perspective on this. Here's what I want you to take away from Jocelyn Ardmore's story. The most painful part isn't usually when you discover someone's true motivation. The most painful part is realizing how long you ignored the signs because you wanted so badly to believe the narrative they'd built. But here's the hope in this story. When Jocelyn Ardmore finally said no to funding a lie, her son came home. Real relationships don't require wire transfers. They require presence. They require showing up even when it's inconvenient. They require choosing people over projections. If you're in a situation where someone is asking you to fund their ambitions while excluding you from the results, please take it seriously. Not because you're cynical, but because you love them too much to let them build a life on an unstable foundation. Your role is to be a structural engineer in your own family, to identify the stress points before the collapse, not after. And if you're someone who's been positioned as an ATM for someone else's life project, remember this. Saying no to that dynamic is not selfish. It's actually the most loving thing you can do. Because you're refusing to enable a system that hurts both of you.